It's now time for the final session of the day. Reading can open doors to nature. Almost everyone here would know of Greta Thunberg and Fridays for Future. Since 2018, both these names have been dominating youth activism that has been a major shot in the arm for the global environmental movement. Today, I have with me three young and bright women from Fridays for Future India, Disha Ravi, Sriranjini, Raman, and Tamanna Sengupta. You may have heard their names, but what you don't know, let me complete. What you may not know is that all three of them share a common passion for reading that has guided their journey in fundamental ways. So in some form of divine justice, at the end of everything that happened today, we have these three fabulous young women, and I can't express just how happy I am to be in discussion with them. The world, it seems, is divided into people who believe in the power of words to stimulate change and those who dismiss them as lip service. By some measure, this division of thought applies to youth activism for the climate crisis too, with many instating all the hope in the world in it and others calling it naive at the very best and an attention-seeking antique at the very worst. How does one reconcile these binaries? How have words been the change for you in your journeys?
I'll start just by first saying thank you to Greenlitfest and the team for inviting me here, and also expressing solidarity with the Jainu Kuruba community outside. I think their action leads into my response that it's very important. I think all of us feel at some point that what we're doing is not enough. But then we've also found each other through this process. So at times, although it feels naive, then you also see the amplitude of the movement right now and how many people from various backgrounds, various places, communities and issues that we've not even heard about coming to the forefront, like the one that I think you all witnessed today. I think it's mostly about finding your community and then having these conversations openly, deciding what for me is change and then what is change in my community. That's how I differentiate between what is naive and what is actual action.
Thank you for having us, Meghaa. It's really nice to be here. I think I echo Tamanna's words when we say we extend the solidarity with Jainu Kurubas who are outside and who are protesting. And I think one thing that caught me in the question that you asked was, are protests attention grabbing? And they are. That is the whole point of protest, to grab attention, because one very clear example is, let's talk about the Jainu Kurubas themselves. They've been protesting for decades inside their own homes or the borders of where they were kicked out, but they weren't heard. They had to come to spaces, they had to come to the capital city where they're made and treated as the others to be heard. Protest is a theatrical, attention-grabbing experience for people to understand what our demands are, because they haven't been heard and they've been deliberately suppressed in other areas. And for me, words are very powerful in that way, because my first introduction into the climate movement were through stories, not necessarily through books, but stories I heard from my grandparents, stories I heard from different communities that we work with, because I didn't have access to a lot of the books, wonderful books that were presented today, because non-fiction isn't something that's very accessible to most people. My earliest introduction were through word-of-mouth stories, which were beautiful, which are now being translated into books. But and then it was climate fiction, which I hold very close to my heart even today. And it's more recently been climate non-fiction, and I love all of them varyingly, with definitely a partial side to climate fiction. But words carry a lot of meaning and power, and it's also important where the words are spoken, because that decides who's listening.
Thank you guys for that. Actually, that's a question that is also often posed to writers, artists, illustrators, everybody in the creative community. And that is our collective response is word. As a community, I think, is that words are meant, like I think it was Arundhati Roy who said that, I want to shout from the rooftops. I want to grab attention. I want people to listen. And so, yes, absolutely understand where you're coming from and truly, appreciate that viewpoint. So, going to the next question. We've got book recommendations from Tamanna and Sriranjini on sustainability next. And a similarity between them is a certain gravitation towards books by authors who belong to and speak of marginalized voices, indigenous communities, caste groups. One common book that seems to have hit a chord with both of you, we've not yet got Disha's recos, but they should be coming soon. A common book that has hit common ground is Braiding Sweet Grass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who belongs to an indigenous tribe and writes of the importance of indigenous ecological knowledge for mainstream Western science. How are you finding and identifying with these books? And is it because at some fundamental level you feel that it resonates with youth voices that are often marginalized as too inconsequential to matter? Sriranjini, I'll start with you.
Yeah. I'll connect this to the story of how I got into the climate space in the first place. So in fourth grade, I was in my house and looking around in the cupboards, and I found a 1983 copy of Snakes of India by Romulus Whittaker. And I opened that book and I just fell in love and realized I just want to be in the forest with the reptiles for the rest of my life. But in that book was also the mention of the Irula tribe, some of the best knowledge keepers when it comes to snakes in India. And that was probably the first time as a child or in school that I learned about forest dwelling communities and tribes in a book. And that interest in snakes led to me volunteering at Madras Crocodile Bank Trust and actually getting to work with the Irulas and watching them. But even though I did that in school and high school, I'm currently a student in Canada. I go to the University of Waterloo, but it wasn't until I left Bangalore, which is a bubble, and went to another country that I was like, oh my God, like we never learned about indigenous people in our own schools, or we never read books about them, and we never just why don't we talk about indigenous rights in mainstream spaces, and why are they excluded from literature, why are they excluded from our education? So that led to a deep interest, because even in India, the topic of conservation, most of the mainstream narratives and the mainstream thought leaders of conservation in India are upper caste or do come from privileged backgrounds. We don't have stories or books published by the people on the ground. So there needs to be that change. And even within the movement, like within FFF, when we first started, we were all like, oh, climate emergency, let's strike every Friday. And we were just following what was being followed in Europe or what the mainstream narrative was. But we had to, and again, FFF started in cities, and we weren't really grassroots, and we made a lot of mistakes. But through books like Braiding Sweetgrass, where they talk about an honorable harvest, which is basically only taking what you need, or like reciprocity, like all these values that we never really included while talking about climate science, are there in these books. And so so that's how our interest within the movement, we realized we really need a shift. We can't just keep talking. We have to go on the ground and come up with India's own like narratives and what do we want to do, and what mistakes, if we do what we're doing right now, how are we're going to be no different to what's been in the environmental movement for the past 40-50 years, which has led to what is happening now. So the only way to change that is to amplify and have leadership from marginalized communities. And that's why books are also super important with respect to
That's
that.
a wonderful answer, because people forget when they talk of the environmental movement that the women's movement has a very long history of protest, and that's responsible for a lot of women being where we are today. So it's something that I absolutely agree with. But I also want to ask you: have Any three of you ever sort of had this query from people about girls from a certain sort of level of privilege, supporting the causes that you do? I mean, one is access to reading itself is a privilege in this country. And two, this is a common question that often comes up. I mean, why are some voices marginalized and why are some not? And, why are own voices not getting the platform that they ought to get? Is it because privilege is a reality we've got to live with? So if, Disha, you want to take that question.
Yeah, so before
Sorry,
that,
sorry.
I just wanted to add that, we do, all of you in this room have a lot of access to networks and through your art, through your literature. So it would be awesome if you could connect with us to actually understand better where the Jaina Kuruba community is coming from, what is happening to them, and how we can help. And we stand in solidarity with them.
Yeah, I fully agree with what Sriranjini said, because I think the protest that was held today wasn't against Greenlit Festival. It was against some funders, I think. I will name them elaborately in detail later on. But what is important is to understand that we need to break out of that bubble, and it is important for us to face with the uncomfortable truths. And some of these truths have hurt people, and it is important for us to live with that uncomfortable reality and break out. And to answer your question, books are a privilege. I think my first interaction with books were when I was in 5th grade, when I saved up all my year's allowance to buy a book at this some roadside vendor who had it really cheap, and it was an Enid Blyton book. It was The Secret Seven. I don't remember which one, but I was very happy to find it. And I hated school, so I was reading it in school. And someone in school actually saw that, and she's like, "Oh, I read something similar too." And that began the story of how I got access to book, because my friend, who soon became very close to me, gave me every single book I read from 5th grade to 10th grade, because our library was inaccessible to people who weren't at the top of that class, and I obviously wasn't, because I absolutely hated school and the rigorous methods of learning that we had to go through. And even then, it wasn't something we didn't learn about nature in school. We didn't learn about that interconnectedness. And if I hadn't met that person, I probably wouldn't have picked up a reading habit anytime in my teenage years. And the fact that books to me before that were hidden was something that's very concerning, because this is the state of so many people, that where so many stories aren't coming to surface. And I think that is something we are trying to change, because everyone deserves to be heard, and not just those people who speak English, not just the people who have a palatable attitude with others. It is important to be uncomfortable and sit with some things that make question your privilege and your identity, and I don't know if you can make peace with it, but at least support the work of others. So I think that is what we are trying to do at FF as well. We've made a lot of mistakes too, and that is something we are trying to unlearn. And if you want a book, there is a book from the Jaina Kurubas, written by them and supported by some FF members. You can go upstairs to the FF stall and you can buy the book so that you can support their work and hear about stories from ground.
Right. Thank you. Tamanna, I'll come back to... Sure, absolutely.
So, apart from books being a privilege, even what's written in the books are often privileged. And
Yes.
with respect to green books and education, it's amazing that we even have this festival, because growing up in schools, like how often did we even have... First of all, we don't have access to nature, because it depends on or environmental education, but there's no necessarily green books in the curriculum itself. If I go back and think about what I learned in environmental education in school, it was often about dams and protected areas. and it was often about environmental leaders who introduced policy,
Yeah.
but it was often not about ecologies.
Right.
Like schools sort of encourage into the system where we can name 100 brands and 100 corporations, but we can't name some species around us.
Yes.
But because of access to books, like people who do have access to ecology and being naturalists, even that, how do we sort of get out of that bubble? Because most of the books, green literature that exists in India, comes again from privileged voices. So
Right.
within this space, how can we shift and incorporate, or give platforms for books to include traditional ecological knowledge?
But your privilege has never sort of, in the process of supporting marginalized voices,
Yeah.
has your
So-
privilege ever come into question?
Oh, 100%. I'm like a privileged upper caste Savarna woman, and being in the movement when I first started, I was occupying a lot of space and I had no idea. Like, I didn't even know caste existed until I joined the
Yes.
climate movement. That's in the bubble that I was in. And that's what happens in these spaces where green literature is shared. A lot of kids, a lot of people reading the books, I've never
Yes.
even questioned their own privilege. So I had like a huge unlearning journey of reading books from marginalized authors. They're not necessarily green literature, but they're super connected to social justice, land rights, and
Yes.
everything green literature should stand for. So yeah, I think in 2020 during the pandemic, like I realized that, oh my god, like my ancestors are oppressors. I'm probably contributing to oppression on a daily basis. What can I do to unlearn? So I
Right.
started reading Ambedkar. I started reading books by like indigenous authors, and I was like, oh my god, FFF, we can't continue doing what we're doing. So we started building partnerships and started having listening circles with indigenous youth from different parts of the state, parts of the country. And now we have FFF chapters across the country where there are like indigenous youth who are involved, and trying to get their narrative into the mainstream. But even within the climate justice space, there's still so much unlearning that needs to be done constantly. And the best way to do it is through books, but also through like storytelling, and also questioning your own community. The other thing with privilege is once you realize, like, oh my god, you're privileged and you want to help, it often becomes like the charity model of, oh, how can I like donate or support or help an oppressed community. But it's more of like, how can you dismantle the behaviors and practices within your own community, and even within conservation, or like how do we just create like how do we dismantle the structures of leadership that exist and have like more decentralized systems with leadership from marginalized communities.
But
That's
actually, in India,
missing.
we do have a very strong, actually, history. If you read the history of India, in the 1970s, we had the Dalit Panthers. And we have, I think, the voices of the Dalits have, and then the stream of consciousness literature is really a very sort of strong model of literature that makes us realize our privilege and, makes us more conscious of it. So I absolutely understand. And it's very interesting that they chose to write the literature that they did to make themselves heard. So more proof of the fact that literature should not be dismissed as inconsequential. That should be the last adjective applied to it. I'm now going to go on to a question, and I'd like to begin with Tamanna. I usually find that, when we look at book recommendations, a lot of young people have like a surfeit of international names come up. Naomi Klein, Robert McFarlane, Rebecca Solnit. I could go on. Is this because the literature from India isn't up to the mark yet? Or is it because reading culture bolstered by robust commitment to environmentalism is missing? Or is it a combination of both of these? Do you want me to repeat the question?
Yeah, just a summary of that.
So what I'm essentially trying to say is, why are so many international books often like featured in, recommended environmental books by a lot of young people in India? And I was just wondering, is it something to do with the fact that our literature is either not up to the mark, or it's not supported by the sort of robust reading cultures that some of these countries have, especially when it comes to green literature?
I would say I don't think it's that the quality of the literature is not up to the mark, because all the Indian authored books that I have read on the environment, they're all very nuanced, and they teach you a lot of things that, like Disha and Sriranjini said, school doesn't. But I do think there is a lack of support. I think there's a lack of urgency regarding why reading Indian authored books is important. Because like they said, even I've learned in school about dams and geography, but never about the people in those geographies or what is happening to the people affected by those dams. So, thank you. So, yeah, I think the fact is that global books, they're more generalized, they're easy. If you want to learn about the environment, you pick up. My first book was Dr. Seuss, The Lorax, in terms of environment. So, it's easier to gravitate towards that. And then when you already have those, why think of Indian authors? Because it's no longer a need. But I think if you change that and you think about, for parents, think about introducing your kids to the diversity, not just in terms of, we know our country is diverse, but we don't really think about all of the different communities, the different cultures, and also how each of them are differently impacted by climate change. And quite honestly, my introduction to this whole movement came through science. It came when I was doing my master's. So it was through research papers, really complex language, and I was looking for things that will really simplify those, because I was starting from scratch. That's when I came across Yuvan's book, and also Green Humor, eventually Megha's book as well. Yeah, I think thinking about introducing your kids to that, thinking that it's important for your kids to know the injustices that happen, and these injustices also snowball into bigger issues affecting everyone in very, very different ways. It's important to know that in order to build this solidarity that you're seeing on stage, or the solidarity that we're expressing with other communities. Yeah.
Yes, sure.
A lot of the books you mentioned are written by like privileged authors in the West,
Yes.
and it's read by privileged people in the country. But with respect to green books and green literature, often the stories on the ground, like we don't have the trending environmental books. We don't have that about like land rights movements, or even like like communities on the ground who are actually struggling to protect their land or trying to save different species. Now we do have stories in India of how communities are coming together, community-based conservation, or they're coming together to save species or protect their like traditional ecological knowledge. But in India also, I think if for books to be in the mainstream, we will need language is another huge issue. There are probably amazing books in like Odia, Marathi, Kannada about like books about the struggles of like maybe Mali Parbat or the Bang Valley, where indigenous people on the ground are trying to protect their forests, they're trying to protect the land, they're trying to conserve their ways of living, but it's just not in English. So translation or access to language and whose books gets published, I think that's another reason because of the mainstream. Yeah.
That's actually a very important point you made, because just last night we were thinking of, I mean, we're a small festival and, we just started out. We were thinking of what more do we need to do, at least, which is manageable. And one of the first things that came out is to look at regional languages. And what's interesting for us is also that in the last few years, translations into English from regional literature have been just so spectacular. And we've had authors like Perumal Murugan coming out of Tamil, and so many others. And really, translated literature has been doing really well. But that's a great point that you raised, Ranjini. Well, many young activists have chosen to pen books themselves. So, beginning with Greta, and any such plans for any of you? Any?
I don't know if it's a full-fledged plan, but it is something I hope to do. Like I said, my introduction to climate science was scientific literature, and I found it really boring. So, yeah. So, yeah, condensing those into, a little while back, Bijal named it narrative non-fiction. So making it a story and making it more fact-based, but a story that you'd be interested in learning.
Yes.
I'm hoping to do that, maybe, hopefully soon.
Yes, very much so. Disha?
Sorry, just to add, one day I would love to write fiction, climate fiction, because I've learned way more about the planet and the environment from fiction books I've read from like Amitav Ghosh, from not Indian writers, but like like global South women writers, like Elif Shafak. They were so powerful and beautiful. And they really moved me in ways that non-fiction could have never. So I would one day love to write climate fiction and hope that young children especially, would read it.
That's wonderful. Sriranjini?
I think I agree with Tamanna's point about narrative non-fiction. I feel like a lot of us here or people I've connected with has been because we share our stories online through narrative non-fiction about what's happening on the ground or what we're unlearning within ourselves or how to build community and how to protect the planet, but also what do we value and how do we unlearn. But no, I haven't thought about a book yet. Maybe
Someday all three of you could pool in your heads and write a book. I'm sure there'll be lots of people in this room wanting to read such books. And it's interesting that you mentioned earlier, there's something that crossed my mind. One, of course, when we look at books year on year, we find, especially in the children's category, narrative non-fiction is a lacking space. So, to any children's publishers who happen to listen to this conversation, really want more of narrative non-fiction. The other thing is that we've had some fabulous books on indigenous communities come out in the children and young adult space in recent times. I can recall at least 3 books in a very, very recent history that touched upon this for anybody who's interested. Year of the Weeds by Siddharth Sharma, Unga by Devashish Makhija, and I think there was a book in our children's category this year, Pedru and the Big Boom, by Nandita Dakuna, that did touch upon this very sort of vividly on how mining often impacts the rights of people living in places where land is treated as a resource and not respected.